Our speaker today is Dr. John Teehan. He's a professor of religion at Hofstra University, and I should say a newly named professor of religion, having just been promoted from associate professor, which in this day and age is quite an accomplishment with the way universities and not promoting people. Dr. Teehan received his master's degree in psychology from Queens College and his PhD from the Graduate Center of CUNY. His talk today is entitled Evolutionary Origin of Religious Ethics and Violence, and a good portion of this is comes from his first book, which is newly published, entitled In the Name of God. And there are flyers on the back table because I'm sure you're going to be engrossed by what he has to say and want to run out and buy a copy of the book.
Good morning. I'm very pleased to be able to be here with you today and have a chance to talk to you about these ideas and about the book that's just come out. And what I will do in the talk is going to go through the book and some of the main topics. While writing this book is clearly a professional activity, it's also a very personal one. I've had a lifelong interest in and connection with religion, and while I've personally developed a naturalistic worldview, I continue to be fascinated by the power that religion has to move people to do good and to move people to do evil. It seems to me that there are few, if any, other human practices that have had the power and the impact on human behavior in society that religion has had. But why is that? What is it about religion that allows it to move people to sacrifice their comfort, their security, their lives, at times to help people who may be strangers? What is it that gives it the power to move people to sacrifice not only their lives, but the lives of other people? In regards to the question of religious violence, it seems to me that this all too common response, right? We hear this all the time, that religious violence is not really about religion. It's an abuse of religion. It's flawed human beings taking something that's intrinsically good and peaceful and twisting it. That seems to me a wrong analysis, but it also seems to be based on a simplistic understanding of religion, and one that woefully underestimates the power of religion. So my goal then in writing this book was to investigate religious moral systems and the relationship between religious morality and violence, using the tools and the methods of the cognitive sciences, in particular the field known as evolutionary psychology. Now, cognitive science teaches that our minds are composed of various mental tools. It's one of the metaphors, and they're still struggling with what's the right metaphor to use. But that's what I'll talk about, these mental tools. These are cognitive, emotional predispositions that shape how we perceive and how we respond to our world. Evolutionary psychology holds that these mental tools are themselves the product of human evolution. These tools are grounded in the structure of the human brain. The brain is a physical organ, and as with all physical organs, it has been shaped by the forces of natural selection over the course of human evolution in the service of human survival and reproduction. The brain is what it is. It works the way it works, at least in part, because of the particular challenges faced by our ancestors. According to this understanding of the mind, the mental tools that we have today originally were designed to respond to challenges faced by our earliest ancestors. And by coming to understand just what those challenges may have been, we can gain insight into the human condition. Recently, in the past 20 years or so, researchers using these methods have turned their attention to religion. The central claim of what has become known as the cognitive science of religion, this is a new paradigm in studying religion, it is a developing field, a lot of controversy, disagreement, but a central claim that's shared by most of these researchers is that religious beliefs and religious behaviors arise from the natural workings of the human mind, that certain mental tools that evolved to serve survival and reproductive needs also, under certain environmental conditions, predispose us to interpret the world in ways that give rise to beliefs in spirits, ghosts, and gods. And this is a fascinating field, and I believe it represents one of the most promising developments in the attempt to gain a scientific understanding of religion. What I'd like to do today is to spend some time talking about the work, some of the research that informs my writing. So I'm going to start with a quick overview of some of the issues that I set out in the first 2 chapters of my book, where I develop a model for understanding our evolved moral psychology, but also understanding our evolved religious psychology. I'll then use that model to explore religious morality. Now, religious morality is, of course, a broad and general term, and I don't mean to reduce the diversity of religious thought to some generic version. But I do claim that there is a certain psychological structure that is common to many familiar religious moral traditions. This psychological structure is a foundation upon which the various religions build their particular moralities. I also claim that this moral psychology is the source of religion's power to motivate humans to act in loving, selfless, even self-sacrificial ways. But it is the psychological basis for all the positive pro-social actions that religion generates. But I also claim that the same moral psychology that generates such positive religious behavior is also the source of all the prejudiced, divisive, and violent acts that religion generates. Religious violence, I argue, is not an aberration, right? It's not a corruption of some pure, authentic, loving religion. It is an expression of religious moral psychology, particular circumstances. Right? Having set up this model, I then use it to explore religious morality. In particular, I use it to examine biblical moral traditions. If our evolved psychology shapes the way we interpret and respond to the world, then it also shapes the way we come to think about God and God's laws. We should then be able to detect the influence of this evolved psychology in the pages of Scripture. So once I've introduced the model, we can take some time to look at some examples of this. My book concludes with a chapter reflecting on what all of this means for our understanding of religion and religious morality, what it might tell us about religious violence in the modern world. I'll conclude my talk with a brief discussion of some of these thoughts, and then read to you, if I may, the conclusion of my book. Okay. Now, accounts of our evolved moral psychology are, as you might expect, quite complex. Given the time constraints, I'm only going to focus on the basic function of morality from this evolutionary perspective. In an evolutionary context, right, the issue is most often discussed in terms of altruism. Altruism is defined as acting for the benefit of another person at some cost to yourself, right? And this poses a problem from an evolutionary perspective. In the most basic sense, evolutionary success is measured in how many copies of your genes you get into the next generation. So natural selection should favor those individuals who promote their own interest at the expense of others. In this sense, altruism is counterproductive. Right? You're sacrificing resources that you could use for your own success to benefit someone else who may be a potential competitor. Altruists should not fare well in the evolutionary struggle. And yet, human altruism is widespread. Right? So this was a major quandary for evolutionary study of morality. How to explain something that shouldn't evolve, but which obviously is a widespread and well-attested phenomenon. Today, there are many accounts of how altruism could have evolved and taken hold in human nature. And these accounts are supported by a growing number of empirical studies. I want to focus now on just one particular mechanism. Right? So there are many mechanisms that are proposed and work together, but I'm going to look at just one today, and this is a mechanism known as reciprocal altruism. Right? Reciprocal altruism. And this is a fairly straightforward concept. Right? My sacrificing resources for you makes sense if you reciprocate and sacrifice some of your resources to me now or at some future date. Right. As this model was developed, we came to see that the payback for my sacrifices need not be made directly for me in order for it to work. We're social creatures. Our good is tied up with the good of our community. So my investment in you, my helping you when you're in need, right, can pay off when you contribute to the well-being of the community to which we both belong. You do not have to pay me back directly. Right? This is sometimes called indirect reciprocity. Moralities then function as systems of indirect reciprocity. Right? These systems encourage social cooperation and punish socially disruptive behavior. The payoff, in evolutionary terms, for my investing in the good of the group, for cooperating with my neighbors, is a stable social environment in which I may more effectively pursue my goals and pursue the good for my family. So this is a basic moral function, evolutionary function of morality. Now these systems work, however, only if people actually contribute to the social good. If I am the only one willing to sacrifice for the common good, and while others just selfishly pursue their own good, I'm going to lose out in the competition for life. If too many people opt out of the social contract, the group as a whole becomes vulnerable. So evolution has provided us with a suite of moral emotions designed to encourage cooperation and discourage defecting from the social contract. We're very sensitive, right, to people who do not reciprocate. We feel great anger when we sense we're being cheated or taken advantage of. And we feel great admiration and appreciation for those who make sacrifices for the group, for those who commit themselves to protecting the group. So the development of moral emotions and the moral intuitions that support indirect reciprocity has allowed us to become the most social creatures on the planet. There's no species that matches humans in terms of the complexity of our social environment. This is the distinguishing human trait, right? No creature has such complex social environments. But there's a limitation to this moral psychology, right? This moral psychology is directed toward members of our own group. And this makes sense in evolutionary terms, right? Since it's members of our group who are in a position to reciprocate. It's members of our group that we can come to trust. And it is members of our group who are committed to the good of my group, right? People who are not members of our group have their own interests, their own commitments, their own communities, right? And these commitments may not coincide with ours. In our earliest human environments, right, humans who were not part of your group likely were competitors and so were dangerous, right? Moral psychology evolved to promote in-group cooperation. It does not extend, at least not in the same way, right, to people who are outside the group, right? Therefore, it becomes crucial to be able to determine who is part of my group and who is not. For our earliest ancestors, this was a fairly easy task. Groups were small, and they were usually composed of kin. And so keeping track of who was a member of my group and who was not a very difficult challenge. However, humans did not continue to live in small tribal groups. As groups expanded in size, our moral psychology was challenged. In a large society, it's too demanding to keep track of who you can trust and who you must be wary of. It's not at all obvious who is part of the in-group and who is not. Right? So this imposes a limitation on the size of human groups. And for most of our history, humans lived in very small groups. The estimate is no more than 150 individuals. Right? But obviously, we got past this. We found a way of moving past this psychological limitation. And it's here that religions come into play. Religion functions, at least one of the functions of religion, is to extend our evolved moral psychology so that we can develop moral systems that are effective in larger and more complex groups. Religion is not the only way to do this, but it's been one of the most time-tested and common ways of doing this. Right? So religion helps us to expand the extent of our moral psychology. And there are two important ways that religion can do this. One is by establishing a shared belief in a God who is concerned with the moral behavior of the group, who has both the power and the inclination to enforce the moral rules. Such a God strengthens the moral bonds of a group by making the rewards and the punishments for behavior more certain. I may not be able to keep track of who is cooperating, contributing to society, but God can. A God who is known to be diligent in meting out rewards and punishments lowers the risk that my sacrifice to the group will not be reciprocated by others. And this makes social cooperation more likely. Throughout both the Hebrew Scriptures and the New Testament, we were presented with a picture of a God that makes clear in vivid and dramatic detail that this God is an effective and reliable enforcer of the moral code. However, this strategy only works if other members of the group also believe in God. If you do not share my belief in a moral God, I cannot trust that you have the necessary motivation to keep the moral code. So the dilemma of determining who we can trust and who we cannot remains. And in larger, more anonymous societies, this can undermine the moral bond that stabilizes the group. Well, here religion makes another important contribution. If I can signal to you that I too believe in your God, and that I therefore expect God to punish my sin, I thereby signal to you that I'm a trustworthy member of the group. So for this to work, however, such a signal must be reliable. Simply saying, I believe in God, is not a reliable signal because it's too easy to fake. A reliable signal is one that indicates that I've already invested time and energy and resources in our group. That is, it must be costly. Religions, through their elaborate rituals, their requirements of self-denunciation, their complex belief systems, serve as costly signals of commitment. Think of how much effort and time goes into mastering, for example, kosher requirements. Knowing all the particularities of what foods can and cannot be eaten, which foods can be eaten but not in conjunction with other foods, what utensils can only be used with certain foods, requires a long time immersion in the practices of the group. Right? It functions as a costly signal of commitment. It is unlikely that an outgroup member would go to all the trouble of learning these complex regulations just for the chance to take advantage of your kindness. Right? So religions extend the function of our moral psychology by establishing a God who oversees the moral bonds and enforces moral behavior, but it also provides signals of commitment, ways of showing that I am committed and invested in the group. Right? And these are costly signals that explain a lot of the complexity of religious beliefs and rituals and practices. All right. So with these concepts in hand, we can now consider what they have to say about morality expressed in the Bible. In my chapter on Judaism, I begin by discussing how evolutionary psychology may shed some insight into the moral character of God, as presented in the Hebrew Scriptures. For example, the notion that Yahweh is a jealous God. From a certain moral perspective, this is a somewhat troubling notion. Jealousy is a human flaw, not something we would expect of a morally superior being. Yet time and time again, Yahweh himself admits to being a jealous God. However, from an evolutionary perspective, this makes some sense. God functions as a moral enforcer of the community's moral code. By ensuring that those who break the code are punished, God promotes social cooperation. By making it costly to break that code, God makes it less costly to contribute to the common good. But to serve as a reliable enforcer, we must have confidence that God is committed to punishing sinners. And a jealous God fills that role well. Jealousy leads people to act rashly and often violently. A person in the throes of a jealous rage cannot be reasoned with, cannot be bargained with. Such a person will go to any lengths to punish a transgression. Now, while jealousy can be a source of great personal turmoil, a person jealously attached to the code of the group makes for a very reliable and effective moral enforcer. And the Bible provides numerous examples that Yahweh will respond with passionate force in the face of defection from the group. It's also interesting to note that the description of Yahweh as a jealous God is specifically used in the Bible in relation to the sin of idolatry. All right, again, this makes some sense. If God represents the moral code that binds a society together, being unfaithful to the God of your group represents the threat of defecting from the social contract. And this is a greater threat than violating any particular commandment. Right? For this threat, defecting from the group threatens the moral boundary between the in-group and the out-group. And that is a boundary that must be jealously guarded. So again, from a certain moral perspective, a jealous, violent God is troublesome. From an evolutionary perspective, such a God makes a very reliable and effective enforcer of the group's moral code. In the remainder of that chapter, I examine the Ten Commandments, and I argue that we can see that these rules function to establish God as the moral center of the community and to establish the grounds of reciprocity that allow the group to function as a stable community. Now, I've given numerous talks on these issues, and I found that my discussion of the Hebrew Scriptures from an evolutionary perspective generally receives an open, sympathetic response. But when I try to extend this analysis to Christianity, I've been faced with greater resistance. The argument's been made by some scholars, as well as by members of my audiences, that Jesus came to transcend just those aspects of Judaism that reflect our evolutionary psychology. Perhaps it is said, in the Hebrew Bible, right, morality divides the world into in-group and out-group. But in Jesus, there is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither slave nor free, there is neither male nor female, for you are all one in Christ. That's Paul in Galatians. And what is this if it's not a repudiation of the in-group, out-group divide? Also, it said, while the Mosaic law may function to establish a system of reciprocity, Jesus taught us to love your enemies, to do good to those who hate you. To him that strikes you on the cheek, offer the other also. That is, he taught a moral code that goes explicitly against the logic of reciprocation. Christianity, it is held, transcends our evolved psychology. I disagree with that conclusion. Christianity presents a different moral system than we find in Judaism, but my argument is that Christianity is just as much an expression of our evolved moral psychology as Judaism is, but one that is shaped by different historical and cultural environments than that which shaped the Hebrew Scriptures. We can find within the moral code set out in the New Testament the logic of reciprocity and the workings of the in-group, out-group mentality. Now, I argue for this in detail in what is the longest chapter of my book, but here I want to spend our time considering the notion that even Christianity divides humanity into moral groups. Before turning to that, I do want to say that in terms of reciprocity, Christianity also taps into the evolved psychology of reciprocity. People who are opposed to this point that Jesus says that we should do good without thought of reward. And that's true, he says that, but it's clear that we should do good without thought of reward on earth, right? But your reward will be reciprocated. Your actions will be reciprocated. Right? You will be paid back for being good, only that reward is transferred to heaven rather here on earth. Right? So the logic of reciprocation is found throughout the New Testament, throughout the moral teachings of Jesus. Just the payback is shifted to the afterlife rather than here as it is in Judaism. All right, I want to look at this idea that Christianity does divide the world into different moral groups. Again, in discussing this has been the biggest obstacle with both audiences and scholars, Christian scholars, who want to argue that Christianity has a universal universal morality. So the idea that Christianity sets a boundary of moral concern around an in-group requires a more involved discussion. It cannot be denied that in his teaching, Jesus explicitly renounces all the signals of commitment that typically divide one group into another. For example, when Jesus taught the crowds to love your neighbor as yourself, he was then asked, who is my neighbor? Well, this is another way of asking, who's in my group? Jesus famously responds to this with the parable of the Good Samaritan, in which the moral hero is a member of a reviled out-group, while members of the in-group, a priest and a Levite, fail the moral test. With this story, Jesus signals that your neighbor is not determined by ethnicity or nationality, but by moral behavior. Jesus also rejects kinship as a morally significant distinction. In another story, told that his mother and brothers had come to see him, Jesus asked, who is my mother and who are my brothers? He answers this question by pointing to his disciples and claiming that here are my mother and brothers. For whoever does the will of my Father in heaven is my brother and sister and mother. Now, what Jesus is doing here and elsewhere in the Gospels is not rejecting the psychology of the moral group, but redefining the group. No longer will the group be defined by ethnicity or kinship or any other superficial distinction. The group will now be defined by those who commit to the moral code that allows us to live together as a community, and all are welcomed into that community. I must say that I believe that this may represent a high watermark in human morality. Given the pull of our psychology, it just may not be possible to avoid dividing the world into in-groups and out-groups. And given our psychology, that divide is going to trigger different moral reactions. We respond with greater sensitivity and concern to those we identify as us, and we are more critical toward, less morally sensitive to those we identify as them. Given this, right, that it just may not be possible to get past this psychological predisposition. Given this, what better way can there be to define membership in the group than on the basis of moral behavior? So Christ opened up a path toward establishing an expanded moral community. Now, we must recognize that this move is not unique to Christianity, nor was Jesus the first to propose it. We find versions of it in Buddhism. We can find it in philosophical systems such as Stoicism, and we can see it prefigured in some of the Jewish prophets. Right, this does not take anything away from the contributions of Christianity, however, for due to the influence of Christianity, this path, right, opening up the moral community to those who are morally committed, became a major aspect of the West's moral imagination. However, right, however much we must appreciate Christianity's role in expanding our conception of the moral group, we need to recognize that moral behavior is not the only way the New Testament defines the in-group. There is another signal of membership in the group, and one that unfortunately came to play a significant, and I would argue a central role in Christian morality, and that is faith in Jesus Christ. From a psychological perspective, Jesus assumes the role of the moral center of the group. He's the divine being who supports and enforces the moral code that sustains the group. Since a commitment to Jesus signals commitment to the morality of the group, it's not surprising that Jesus assumes such an important role. But how does one signal commitment to Jesus? How do you show that you're part of the group? In Judaism, right, one signaled commitment to God through following the Mosaic law. But Paul teaches that in Jesus we are freed from the law. Instead, it is faith in Jesus that marks one as saved. It is faith in Jesus that marks one as part of the group. Christ tells us, he who believes in me shall never die, but he who does not believe is already condemned. Well, what are we to believe about Christ? The gospel warns us of false prophets who will lead us astray. We must have proper belief. And so for the first time in history, in the first time of religious history, orthodoxy, correct belief, takes a central role in religion. And this is a fateful move. Since religion expresses and shapes our moral psychology, since it defines the boundaries of the moral group, to make proper belief the signal of membership in the group imbues religious doctrine with tremendous power and significance, and it helps to explain the passionate and often deadly disputes over matters of doctrine that so mar the history of Christianity. All right. So this is what I'm doing, setting up this analysis of Christianity and Judaism from this perspective. What I want to do now is just to share with you some of the lessons that I pull from my study of religion. In the book, I argue for these points, but here I just want to set them out. All right. These are some of the conclusions I'm drawing. Contrary to the claims of some of religion's harshest critics, the cognitive sciences show that religion is not a mental aberration. It is not a sign of intellectual weakness or laziness. Religion arises from the natural workings of our evolved mental tools. Now, this does not imply that any of the claims of religion are true, but it does suggest that the religious sentiment is deeply embedded in our psyches. It is part of our nature. Since religion is so deeply embedded in our psyches and so deeply entwined with our moral sentiments, religions have great power to do both good and harm. Both are authentic expressions of our religious psychology. Religious violence is not some deviation from an essentially peaceful religion. It flows from the logic of the evolved moral psychology that underlies religious morality. As I have argued, one of the key functions of religion is to establish the boundaries of the moral community. This contributes to the development of stable, cohesive groups, promotes social cooperation. But in determining who is part of my group, and so worthy of moral treatment, we also establish who is not part of the group, and so not deserving of the same moral consideration. By dividing the world into in-groups and out-groups, and by investing that moral divide with divine sanction, religions raise the stakes of any conflict. No longer are those who oppose my group simply human beings with conflicting interests. They are now pitting themselves against God, and they stand outside the bounds of moral consideration. This is the recipe for religious violence. I believe that this work also has something to say about the moral authority of religion. Religious moralities are expressions of our evolved psychology, shaped by cultural and historical circumstances. There is a common moral structure shared by religions, at least the monotheistic religions, but that structure does not stem from religion. It is the result of our cognitive evolution. What is distinctive about the different moral positions of the different religions can be explained, at least in part, by understanding the historical environment in which a religion developed. So what is shared, what is common, morally common to religions, comes from our evolution, the evolution of our cognition. The particular religious teachings are expressions of that common psychology shaped by the history, right, the historical context in which the religions developed. It then follows that no religion can claim a privileged position in terms of morality, nor can any special status be claimed for religious morality in general. No sacred text, then, can claim for itself ultimate moral authority. Not the Torah, not the Gospels, not the Quran. Each is equally a cultural expression of our evolved psychology. However, this does not mean that religions do not possess moral worth. I believe that the sacred texts of the world's religions are a valuable source of moral reflection. These texts are records of some of humanity's most profound reflections on what it means to be human and how we may construct moral communities. We would be foolish to ignore the wisdom they contain. So, if all religious moral systems share a common psychological basis, and yet none can claim a privileged position, how do we assess the particular worth of the various claims made by religion? Here I develop my own viewpoint. From an evolutionary perspective, right, the ultimate goal of morality is to promote social conditions conducive to the pursuit of individual reproductive success. Right? But that's on the level of ultimate evolutionary goals. We do not live our lives on that level. If we translate those ultimate evolutionary goals into the language of lived human experience, we can suggest that the function of morality is to promote stable communities that contribute to the individual flourishing of its members. From this moral perspective, a religious teaching, or any cultural practice, is to be valued just to the degree that it contributes to human flourishing within just societies. And it's to be rejected just to the degree that it impedes the pursuit of these goals. The moral stance that best captures this position is, I believe, humanism. In order to develop this point, I would like to read to you from the conclusion of my book, if I may. Okay. Right. So humanism is a somewhat vague term. It's open to different interpretations and misreadings. So allow me to stipulate what I mean by the term. Right? Humanism is a moral system in which the central value, in regards to which moral judgments are made and moral questions decided, is the well-being, physical, emotional, intellectual, social, spiritual, of human beings. Given our social nature, this entails as an essential component of human flourishing, living in stable, functioning societies that provide for its members opportunities to pursue the good. A practice, tradition, or law is good just to the degree that it serves these moral ends. It is bad to the degree that it works contrary to these ends. Humanism does not deny the diverse sources of identity that constitute human beings, nor does it seek to minimize that diversity. In fact, humanism celebrates human diversity as a testament to the richness of human existence, but just to the degree that this diversity does not impede the central values of humanism. Now, humanism, however, is controversial, at least within the United States, where it is often presented as the opponent of religion. So how does humanism, as I am using it, relate to religion? Actually, based on the analysis that I've made of moral psychology and its religious expression, we can see that humanism can relate quite well to religion. The argument I make for humanism is that it embodies, in proximate terms, the ultimate goals that an evolutionary morality supports, but extends moral concern beyond narrowly defined in-groups. I've argued that the various religious moral traditions we have considered, for all their diversity, are really expressions of the same evolved moral psychology. Given that, these traditions also embody on some level the humanistic value of human flourishing within stable, just societies. Humanism can be promoted within a religious system. It need not be a strictly secular system. But this does not mean that religions are humanistic simply because they're expressions of our evolved moral psychology. Religious traditions developed to serve the goals of individuals and societies at the stage of human development when those systems arose. To the degree that these systems persisted, right, to the degree that religions persisted, they served these goals admirably. Right? However, as social conditions change, moral systems must keep pace if they're to continue to promote human flourishing. But given the generally conservative nature of human culture and practices, this does not always happen. So a religion is humanistic, just to the extent that its values place human flourishing at the center of the moral world. With this definition, there are many religious expressions that are deeply humanistic, but clearly there are many that are not. We must also point out that there are secular traditions that are not humanistic either. So in the end, the key designation is humanism. Whether that humanism is expressed in religious terms or secular terms is morally irrelevant. If we hope to counter the destructive impulses embedded in religious psychology, while continuing to avail ourselves of the sources of meaning and wonder that religion at its best inspires, then we need a religious expression not confined to sect, class, or race, to borrow from John Dewey's great words. Humanism, whether in its secular or religious garb, is that common faith that must be nurtured. Here I do not use faith as the new atheists use it, that is, belief without evidence. For the humanism that Dewey and I advocate is the fruit of a deep engagement with the best science has to offer in terms of understanding the human condition. Instead, it is faith in the sense that Paul Tillich used the term, an ultimate concern, a personal and deep commitment to a moral vision that can shape and sustain our strivings. To the extent that the analysis of religion offered in my book is correct, then it is only a humanistic religion, one that embraces a self-critical, pragmatic approach to its own moral traditions, that can lay claim to our moral allegiance in the modern world, or that can deserve a place in the public square. All others threaten to trap us into cultural constructs that perpetuate a moral outlook designed for a much smaller and a much crueler world. We can no longer afford, nor need we accept, ideologies that so painfully constrict our moral vision. A larger world and a richer existence are there for the making. Thank you. I don't know if we have time for questions or, yeah. As I said, I'm happy to take any questions or that might be, or we can talk later. I don't know how you want to work this.
Anyone like to ask a question? We've got like 5 minutes or so. We can ask questions. Another question.
All right.
Well, I'll ask one.
Okay.
Okay.
How do you, or can you draw some parallels between things like the Spanish Inquisition and, the Holy Roman Empire and what's going on today in the Middle East? I mean, it all seems to be under this umbrella of religious extremism, but there doesn't seem to be any moral value in any of this.
The more sharply you draw that divide between in-group and out-group, the more conservatively, absolutely, you define what it is to be a member of a religious group, right? The higher the stakes become, and therefore the more easily violence is justified. Right? So it's the more absolutistic a religious view is, the more it's going to be prone to violence. And certainly we can see that in the Inquisition and during just the religious violence of the earlier period. And we can see this today. The extremism is using an absolutistic view of what constitutes, for example, Islam. Right? The other danger, which is different here, is when the boundaries of the group are porous, when it's easy to leave the group, right? As it is in the modern world, it becomes even more important for that religion to make sure that the boundaries are tight. And so this leads to it's a vicious circle in which then doctrine becomes even more important. Purity of intention, purity of belief becomes even more important, again, which continues to raise the stakes. I see that there's a psychological similarity to the two. The historical conditions are different, but they're both triggering this deeply embedded in-group, out-group divide, which religion invests with tremendous power. Right? So I do see there's a similarity. We can look at the same psychology being expressed in different historical conditions. Thanks.
What do you see as the future of going in this direction? And maybe, do you think it's being promoted this direction, or do you think it's just hopeless?
I always try to avoid the hopeless answer. Right? What is concerning is we see this not just in religion. We're seeing it in politics of the political culture today. It's this divide. We're drawing the lines more absolutistically, and defining who's an American and who's not an American. That rhetoric is very dangerous. It's very dangerous rhetoric because it does tap into those deep emotional, moral sense, and the more you can draw that divide, the less moral concern you have for people on the outside. So we see this politically, we see it religiously. It's a very dangerous time, I think. So we keep hearing about the need for moderates, and statistically, demographically, so here's the hopeful part, most people are not on those absolute ends of the spectrum. But the language and the rhetoric that's being used publicly, both by religious figures and political figures, taps into very dangerous parts of our psyches. So we need to counter that rhetoric. The rhetoric counts, because the rhetoric, it's only words. No, these words are triggering psychological responses. So we need to counter that. We need to counter not just the doctrines, but the very language that's being used to distinguish, to limit people into small groups. One of the best works I've seen on this, Amartya Sen, the great Nobel laureate, talks about this fact that the danger comes from reducing people to a single identity instead of appreciating that people occupy many, many different overlapping groups. Right? So the more we can focus on that, the more we can push against that rhetoric, I think the more hope there is. But I do see this, the rhetoric politically and religiously, we're in a very dangerous time. Yeah.
You kind of said that, well, do you have something to say towards kind of a coercion of religion? Because I think there's like many cases of that. You know, what was it, I'm not so well learning all these things. I heard there was some years ago, for Islam or something, there was a change to say that there's like beautiful women in heaven. That was actually added in later on in order to entice younger men to get involved.
Well, I think that's being pushed.
Yeah,
it's in the tradition. It's
engineered coercions by specific people that are steering religions in certain ways.
Right. So we get that. That's part of this, strategy of how is it that you keep people, you entice people to a group, and then you keep them in that group. So part of it is the rewards, right, that can come from being part of the group. The other are the punishments for those who are deviating from that path, right? So the strategies, and for people who've been studying, so the strategies of cults and also the strategy of terrorist groups, that's very, very similar, right? So it's an indoctrination into the belief that the group is your family. Right? So your group, and that's one of the deepest parts of our psyche. So that's a very powerful identification. The group is your family. You do anything to protect your family. And so that's, one part is getting people to identify with that small group as a family. And the other part then is seeing that any deviation from the pure code is a betrayal of that family. Right? So it's psychologically coercive. Right? It's psychologically coercive in a very subtle way. All right? We rebel when it's too gross. So when somebody says you have to join or die, there's parts of us that rebel against this, but it's the allure of being pulled into a meaningful group, and that's part of human psychology also. The need to belong to something that matters, something where we feel connected. And that's lost, right? And the argument was made, I think, effectively, the rise of fundamentalism in the Middle East comes from the dislocation of natural communities, right? That can sustain that sense of belonging and meaning. This is the same thing we hear about, inner city youths who are joining gangs, right? That they're being pulled in by a sense of belonging and community. And then once in, that becomes your moral world. So the same sort of thing is going on in cults, it's going on now in these more extremist religious traditions that we're finding in the Mideast. It's filling a vacuum, but it's the need is very human, right? That they're tapping into.
As humanists, how do we avoid the dangers of falling into that same trap as looking at those who are not humanists as the outsiders?
Yeah, good, right? So my idea, humanism is one of those universal terms, right? So what makes us part of that group is, commitment to a moral vision. Right? And that moral vision may be expressed in secular humanistic terms, but we can also find it in religious terms. We can find that commonality, and that's what has to matter, right? There are secular humanist groups which present a very anti-religious rhetoric. In the book, I talk about the famous the new atheists, who are out there very stridently opposing religion. And I agree with many of their sort of substantive points about religious beliefs, but the tone is the exact opposite, right? That you should take if you want to promote a more humanistic world, right? Because what these secular humanists, the new atheists are doing, not all secular humanists, is dividing the world, right? You're either part of this group, the in-group, the new atheists, the secular humanists, and this is where we're rational and reasonable. And if you're outside that group, then you're not rational, you're not reasonable, and you're a danger because you're on the side of the extremists, right? That's a false line to draw, and it's a very dangerous line to draw. So, here's one of the things I hope that comes out of the book is that for humanists to make, you may embrace a secular worldview, I happen to embrace a secular worldview, but to see somebody as part of the other group because their humanism comes in religious language is a mistake. So I think we have to avoid that. That the distinction is not between secular and religious, it's humanist or non-humanistic. And non-humanistic are those who are not respecting the dignity and the value of human nature. So if you're respecting that in a religious sense, I think we have to embrace that. I don't know if that answers your question, Ken. Yeah.
I'm just thinking in terms of really going way, way back before religion, organized religion
Yes.
existed.
Yeah.
And the power of authority and how, people in groups would listen to someone who sets themselves up
Yes.
as an authority, to explain
Mm-hmm.
the natural part of the world that people didn't understand at the time, et cetera. So it seems to me, and that could be wielded for good or evil from the beginning of time. So, but when organized religion was starting, the teachings of Jesus and the teachings of Muhammad and the teachings of in Judaism, then those people who took over the authority there often used it in the way you're saying, to create an in-group.
Right.
But
right.
why, if the teachings were basically originally teachings of, cooperation and love of others, etc., would it be corrupted like that? I mean, were there that many corrupt individuals who took over authority in these religions?
Right.
Is that
Good. Yeah. So one is that teaching, right? Social cooperation and loving your neighbor is really directed toward members of your group, right? And we can find that it doesn't extend the same way. So those texts are written by people of a certain group to other members or potential members of the group. So the problem comes with recognizing there are people outside the group and how to treat them. So it's not the corruption, it's recognizing that these texts are written to a limited audience, however large that may be. The other question, this idea of religion, developing at a certain point, these religious beliefs, sentiments, not organized religion, but religious worldview, goes back as long as humans do. There were always religious elements, and those religious elements were always part of how a group, it seems, as far as our evidence goes back, there seemed to have been some element of a religious, spiritual notion of a totem god or spirit that was for our group. This was special to our group, and ways of identifying, various rituals and taboos were ways of identifying that you were part of this group under the protection of this spirit, right, and not part of that group. So that goes back, it seems, to the beginning of humanity. This division into in-group and out-group seems even older than humanity.
Okay.
Okay. So, okay, thank you.